All right, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief update on the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Achnaf, and good evening from Israel. A lot going on. Probably I could take up the time allotted to me with just one of these subjects that we're going to talk about tonight. So we'll try and get through quite a lot in a relatively short amount of time. The first thing we'll address, obviously, is what is the Trump effect in the Middle East or relating to Israel. After his election, has there been any significant changes regarding Israel and its challenges and its enemies and friends and the region, etc.? First, let's look at Iran. Well, today it came out unofficially, but it seems to have some credence behind it, that Iran has given a message across that it is prepared to delay its reaction to Israel's attack on the country. They claimed that they were going to react, something very painful, very deadly, etc. And Israel took that threat very seriously. Days went by, nothing happened. Basically, it comes out tonight that they've said that they will halt or delay their reaction until some negotiations with incoming president or president-elect Donald Trump. What that means exactly is, is anyone's guess. Is that to talk more about the nuclear program, to talk about their role. There are some who are suggesting, and again, there may be some credence to that, that Iran was looking for an excuse because it really didn't have any good options here. It wasn't really going to be able to do any more serious damage to Israel than it did last time without really upsetting the whole balance of things. And then again, they would know that Israel would go even further than they did last time, and that would mean targeting either the oil or gas industry, perhaps the nuclear program, or even the regime itself. So some are suggesting that it's a Trump effect, some are suggesting it's an excuse. Either way, clearly things are changing in the region as a result. In Lebanon, there is a major push for a ceasefire agreement. At the moment, it's still the Biden administration, Amos Hochstein, their envoy, their special envoy, who is really leading things. But obviously, there is very much the specter, let's just say, of a Trump administration in the background. There are those who feel it's better to get an agreement now before President Trump assumes office. Another possible effect, again, remains to be seen. None of these things are clearly defined, but this week was the end of, I believe, the month that was given by Secretary of State Blinken and Defense Secretary Austin for Israel to make good on certain promises, or at least certain demands, that the US administration had on humanitarian assistance, especially in the north of Gaza. And there was this implicit or even explicit threat that if those conditions were not met adequately, then there would be perhaps a look whether Israel's contravening US law, whatever it is, and the US wouldn't be able to supply at least some of the armaments that it had requested. Well, a month came and went, and in fact, some have argued that Israel gave even or less humanitarian assistance went into the Strip. Israel certainly did make certain steps. They opened another crossing. They allowed lots of trucks to come in. Part of it is certainly, as pretty much throughout the war, is because Hamas took it for themselves. They attacked the convoys. They took over the convoys, etc., etc. But the fact remains, it's clear that Israel did not meet the criteria that the US expected of it. But the US came out today and said that it will still not undertake any sanctions at this time. Again, that could be perhaps because they know that in a government or an administration on its way out, with a far more favorable one coming in, it's a bit of an empty threat that perhaps they could delay it for a few weeks, maybe a month or two. But as we all know, with the January inauguration just around the corner, by the time it would have an effect on the Israeli army, the Trump administration will probably be in. So again, perhaps it's related, perhaps it's not. But again, we do see certain things changing from one week to the next, especially after the US elections. What we know for certain is that so far, many of the Israel-related Trump appointees or nominees, I should say, have been met with great enthusiasm. Chiefly, the US ambassador to Israel will be former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. I personally met him on a number of occasions. I don't know if you will find a greater friend and more consistent friend of Israel in good times and bad times than Governor Huckabee. And that is a choice which was really met with great enthusiasm across the board. He's someone who definitely sits to the far right of Israeli politics in so much that his ideology about Judea and Samaria, about Jerusalem, about how it sees their enemies, very much seen as a very uncompromising friend to Israel on all of these issues, and even had an interview this morning on Israeli radio where he was asked whether there'd be any possible move to sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and he didn't rule it out, which it's interesting. I wonder if that was coordinated with the Trump administration. I'm assuming it was at some level, because the nominee probably at this point, everything he or she says is going to be really raked over the coals. Other choices of Secretary of State Rubio, again, very close friend of Israel, US ambassador to the UN, very strong in Israel. Pretty much all of the major picks that have anything to do with Israel, whether defense, foreign affairs, etc., National Security Council, are considered extremely close to Israel's positions on many, many issues, which really, meets a lot of. There were some concerns that maybe this Trump administration would be different, unshackled by the need to campaign again. Perhaps there was arguments that a lot of the stuff that President Trump did in his last administration was because of the evangelical community, which he needed to be re-elected, which he doesn't need anymore. But the fact that he gave the ambassadorship to Mike Huckabee, who is a well-known, well thought of and very popular evangelical Christian, shows that opinion is not really relevant. So certainly Israel is looking forward to, a lot of people that I've spoken to are very excited and looking forward to meeting and working with their interlocutors. Again, I say meeting. There are very few people in the Israeli government who are not extremely familiar with many of the major players in the incoming administration. What also seems to be playing out in the region as well is very interestingly, Russia seems to be coming back into the region insofar as maybe they can be involved not just in Iran but also in Syria. As we know, Russia have a very strong position in Syria, and there's a series of understandings going back many years between Israel and Russia, exactly what it's allowed and what it's not allowed to do there. It does seem that as part of the possible as part of the Lebanon negotiations, that Israel, again, this is what's been going on behind the scenes. Strategic affairs, Ron Dermer, Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, who is basically Bibi's foreign minister and main advisor on the international stage, apparently went to Moscow this week to discuss a few things, one of them being an understanding that Israel will not do anything to damage Russia's position in Syria. Perhaps that also means implicitly that Bashar al-Assad's position will be even strengthened in the country as long as the Syria-Lebanese border is not used as a conduit to rearm Hezbollah in the future, which is interesting because also that would mean that there would be some sort of negotiations, whether it's through Israel or directly between the US and Russia, to try and get to this all-important, end of war in Lebanon. There does seem to be a lot of optimism on a deal in Lebanon. There seems to be a lot of progress. Israel has said many times that it will only negotiate under fire, pushing through. And interestingly, today, especially, there was a really strong offensive in the Dahia suburb of Beirut, which is the Hezbollah stronghold. They bombed several very important buildings, which are armament factories, missile factories, and silos, etc., etc. So Israel's really sending a very strong message to Hezbollah at this point. Every day you delay in reaching an agreement, we will hurt you more. Let's not forget that Israel's not obviously dealing with Hezbollah, it's dealing with Lebanon through America at this point, and the deal will be signed between the two sovereign governments, but it's clear that Hezbollah are a major player on the Lebanese side. On the other side, Hezbollah are very much trying to send the same message to Israel with, again, a large salvo of missiles and drones entering Israel, even down into the center of the country. But the fact remains, it's clear that Hezbollah is taking a massive hit. And the fact is, Iran ceasefire negotiations for a number of reasons. First of all, because they see that every day Hezbollah is taking more and more of a hit, and every day that goes past, their position will be significantly weakened, which will make it far more difficult for them to rearm in the future. The second, perhaps for Hezbollah and Iran to a certain extent, more important issue is the feeling that because Hezbollah's military position has been severely weakened, its political position is also being subsequently weakened. Hezbollah are a major player, probably the most powerful player in Lebanese politics, but that is taking its toll. We're seeing a lot of Lebanese decision makers, opinion shapers who are coming out against Hezbollah. It's clear that people feel freer to say certain things. There is even those who think that there could be a post-Hezbollah Lebanon. I think that's a little bit premature. But what some are saying is that once this agreement has been inked and Israel does retreat back behind the border, there could be some sort of reckoning within Lebanon. We know that they had a very long civil war back in the 80s. And there are those who are itching to push Hezbollah out even further. So the longer it goes on, the weaker Hezbollah will be, not just in so much as threatening Israel, but also its place in Lebanon. And that is why there seems to be progress on a deal. For Israel, the most important issue and the greatest sticking point is that Israel demands or requires from any peace agreement that it has freedom of action should Hezbollah rearm south of the Litani River. Should it threaten Israel again or anything like that, Israel will ask or require or demand to retain the right of freedom of action, being able to move over the border once again and basically attacking Hezbollah if it feels threatened. That is obviously going to be very problematic for Lebanon as a sovereign country to agree on such a thing. So it does seem at the moment Israel's negotiating largely with the US to try and come to some sort of guarantees. We've seen these kind of guarantees in the past. We saw the Bush letter after the disengagement from Gaza, again, giving Israel the right to respond, which didn't really achieve all it should. So these letters don't have a particularly popular history in Israel, but it does seem that that is the main game in town at the moment. What we are seeing also in Lebanon is an expansion of the ground invasion. They're no longer just in the villages just over the border. Now they're going to the second tier. They're moving further into Lebanon. Again, it's to put pressure on Lebanon. It's to put pressure on Hezbollah to give up, because what we are seeing, as opposed to those first line villages that Hezbollah retreated from, we are seeing pockets of Hezbollah resistance in that second line. And sadly, tonight we heard of the killing, the death of 6 Israeli soldiers from these further incursions. Moving sort of on the more domestic level, we've seen the new defense minister make a couple of faux pas in the last few days since he entered the job. The first was when he said that Israel has defeated Hezbollah. That was considered to be very unwise to say such a thing at this point, because clearly Hezbollah are still not beaten. They are still launching rockets and drones and able to fight against the Israeli ground forces. And the second one he made today, when he talked about the aims of the war, when he was in the north with the chief of staff, when he said that Hezbollah needs to be disarmed. And that is not and has not been one of the official aims in the war. And a lot of people question whether that was just a slip of the tongue or that was something new. There was a clarification later. He meant just south of the Litani River, very much in keeping with UN Security Council Resolution 1701. But we already see the fact that he's been thrust into a job clearly without too much preparation. It's one thing to make comments as a foreign minister, but when you're a defense minister, you're under a far stronger microscope. Everything you say will be pored over. And these comments have not been lost on much of the Israeli public. Two other issues which are of interest more domestically is that one of the reasons for Gallant's dismissal as defense minister, behind the scenes at least, was the fact that he sent out these 7,000 or started moving the process of these 7,000 enlistment papers for ultra-Orthodox potential recruits. What is interesting is these enlistment letters will still be sent out. The Katz appointment as defense minister hasn't stopped that. He doesn't seem to have either tried or succeeded in stopping that at the moment. In the prime minister's office, while his government seems to be a little bit more safe for the moment, his personal situation is certainly worrisome. His legal team did make a request to delay his taking the witness stand or taking the stand in his court case. It's scheduled for 3 weeks' time in December. They already put it off 6 months. He asked to put it off again another 1.5 months. This time the court said no. So in 3 weeks, we will have a prime minister in the middle of a war, having to spend at least 3 days a week from 9 till I think it's 3:30 on the witness stand. And it's said that it will take about 2 months. So that's obviously not where he wants to be, not where he needs to be. But this is the situation we're in. Again, on another level, his chief of staff is going to be investigated tomorrow. He's going to be called in by the police to give testimony on a series of scandals enveloping the prime minister's office, some of which are the changing of protocols in the days after the 7th of October last year. Exactly what the prime minister and the people around him didn't know. There's been suggestions, and there is an investigation that some of the protocols were changed, and there was even a blackmail scheme. This is one of the things which Tzachi Braverman, the BB's chief of staff, is being investigated on, that they tried to blackmail some of the people who changed the protocol, allegedly, we should say at this point, or tried to bring it to attention. And there's still a former spokesperson who is still under investigation for taking documents, top secret documents, and handing them to the media. And there's a number of things going around at the moment in the prime minister's office. He calls them a witch hunt, an attempt to topple a right-wing government. Depends what side of the fence in Israel you are, what you believe, but it does seem that there is the saying, where there's smoke, there's fire, and there seems to be a lot of smoke at the moment around the prime minister's office. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. I will begin here with a question from Leonard Getz. Trump has said he wants Israel to finish the war in Gaza and Lebanon by the time he assumes office. Does Israel view this statement as President Trump's support for a decisive Israeli victory by then?
Well, people around him have said that that they do want the wars finished, but they want them with an Israel victory. It does seem that the war against Hezbollah in the north is weeks away from coming, to a cessation. Obviously, as I always say with these things, something could happen that changes the situation, but there does seem to be a lot of progress on negotiations in the north. Interesting enough, as Israel is really embarking on a major offensive against Hezbollah's, arms caches and other things, but there does seem to be some optimism that an agreement will be found. In the south, I mean, it all depends what you mean a war. Ostensibly, the war in the south is largely finished. Hamas has been largely defeated as a governing body, as a terrorist organization able to threaten Israel as it did before and during October 7th last year. But Israel is not going to leave Gaza by the time Trump comes in. I'm sure Israel could, explain that it's no longer a war. It is more of a guerrilla conflict at this point. So I don't think that if you mean an end to a war, that Israel will be out of the Gaza Strip by the inauguration. I highly, highly doubt that. Even if, there was an end to hostilities tomorrow, I don't see any situation that Israel would just leave a vacuum there and just walk out. And there doesn't seem to be a plan, and there doesn't seem to be anyone coming in to take their place at this point.
All right, thank you. Now, an anonymous attendee asks, is there any indication that President Biden may embargo offensive weapons to Israel as J Street has proposed?
Offensive, I mean, embargo as in just simply not deliver. It's unlikely. Again, as I said before, there is a certain worry amongst the Israeli political class and diplomatic class of an Obama type situation where towards the end, when a new president is coming in and there's that couple of months after the election, and we know that there's a new president elect, that there can be a final message sent to Israel, as Obama did by not vetoing a very important UN Security Council resolution at the time. It was about the settlements. There is a certain amount of worry. There are those who feel that Biden gets Israel a lot more than Obama did. He's described himself as a long-time Zionist. He speaks very fondly of Israel. I had a meeting this week with President Herzog. You can see he is a Zionist. He is someone who considers himself pro-Israel. But there are a lot of people in the administration who are leftovers from the Obama administration who are, let's just say, less enthusiastic about Israel. So that has to be watched. But as I said earlier, perhaps not with armaments, because they know within a few weeks when Trump gets in, any decision will be reversed. So if there is going to be some sort of last minute sort of lunge at Israel, sending a message, whatever it should be, probably won't be in armaments, maybe something at the UN or perhaps something else. Perhaps there is talk that maybe they'll allow a recognition of Palestine as a member of the UN to finally go through. Perhaps that would be in keeping with President Biden's long-stated desire to have a two-state solution with the state of Palestine next to a state of Israel. He would consider that himself. There'd be a lot of people who would disagree with him in Israel, obviously, but he would probably consider that as Zionist action. So that may be something he would countenance. But the prevention of armaments and weapons at this point, something serious on that level, possibly not.
Right, thank you. Now, Jack Berkowitz asks, are the weekly protests in Tel Aviv against Prime Minister Netanyahu and for the release of the hostages still occurring, and are they sizable? And to follow up, we have another question. What is the likelihood that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be removed from office in the near future?
Well, the second question is easier to answer. The likelihood is minimal. There is no real way of reclusing a prime minister. There has been talk of this, that, and the other legal issues. Even there was talk of reclusing the internal security, national security minister, but that's not going to happen. That would really be, a step too far for even the biggest critics of Netanyahu, even though they would probably hope that there was something to it, but it's not going to happen. He's pretty much built a sturdy government. At least, if they can deal with the ultra-Orthodox issue past the budget, they should have a certain amount of political space. Again, once the agreement with Lebanon has been signed, there'll be a backlash against it. And already there are those in the government who are against it, but I think everyone will probably just deal with it, because the right-wing elements know that if they bring down this government, the likelihood is there'll be a far more left-wing government to what we have now. As far as the demonstrations, they go on every Saturday night and sometimes even during the week. It depends what's going on. Obviously, the attention, up until Israel really started to hit back in Lebanon, the hostages and the situation in Gaza was the main focus. Ever since what's been going on in Lebanon with the assassination of Nasrallah, the pages and everything else, the attention has been slightly less. But the demonstrations do go on, and whenever there's some sort of anniversary or birthday or anything like that, the attention does go up. It gets mentioned every day. There was the release of a video today of an Israeli hostage by Islamic Jihad, a dual Russian-Israeli citizen, Alexander Trufanov, if I got the name correct. So things like that obviously will get the attention of the Israeli public, and they're meant to. That's part of the propaganda from the Hamas, the Gazan terrorist organizations. Interestingly enough, that has a Russian angle, and there's talk that part of what Derma was doing in Russia was also talking about that. And there's even an understanding, apparently, when Hamas were in Moscow a few weeks ago, that if there's any agreement, I believe there's only two Russian citizens still in captivity, they'll be the first to be released, or at least, very high up the list. So the hostage situation is mentioned every day, multiple times in the news, and the demonstrations still happen. But it's certainly, there are plenty of other things that are being talked about at the moment that probably weren't 6 months ago.
Great, thank you. Now, Barak Korkmaz asks, after the liquidation of Sinwar and other leading Hamas figures, do you expect to see a Palestinian uprising in the Gaza Strip against Hamas?
Well, interestingly, this week, you had Ohad Hemo, who is an Arab. He's the Arab affairs reporter for the main Israeli news channel, and he's the first Israeli reporter to get up close to Gazans. He was brought in by the army, obviously protected by the army, but he did speak to lots of Gazans who are evacuating from across Gaza, and the ones that he spoke to were extremely anti-Hamas. They said that they're terrible and what they've done to us, they brought disaster on us, etc., etc. There were those who criticized it, saying it was obviously, what could they say? Here's an Israeli reporter surrounded by Israeli army, etc., etc. So what were they going to say? But one thing is clear, that the support for Hamas has gone down, and a lot of people are very angry, not just at what Hamas brought on them, but also the fact that they are taking the humanitarian aid. The cost of food has gone up, the cost of cigarettes has gone up to ridiculous levels, and there has been some demonstrations, even violent demonstrations, against the cost of basic foods and amenities, because it's controlled not just by Hamas, but those who control the flow of food. So there is a lot of anger against Hamas. At the moment, there are suggestions that the things that are being said about Hamas are because also Hamas are not in control as they once were, where one would be extremely afraid to speak out against them. But it's very difficult to really gauge the true story from the polls, or just from a journalist who goes in. It's impossible to know, but it does seem like the support for Hamas is waning.
All right, well, thank you very much. Now we have unfortunately reached the end of this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course, and for our viewers and listeners, please keep an eye on your email inboxes for our weekly podcast offerings email. And if you've not done so already, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can watch this series as well as over 400 of our past podcast episodes. We thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.